My name is Nadine, and I'm 58 years old. That night, my aunt made me come early just to set her dinner table. Not as a guest, but as help. Before the guests arrived, she leaned in close and whispered, "Don't embarrass us again." So I did what I always do. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and let her believe I was still the family failure. But when her wealthy, important guest walked in and stopped mid-conversation to ask for my signature, the look on her face was worth every silent year I'd spent being their joke. They wanted to impress him, but he only wanted to meet me. I never thought that setting a table, something I'd done hundreds of times before, would change the way my entire family saw me. For most of my life, I've been the quiet one, the dependable one, the relative who shows up early, helps clean, and leaves before the gossip starts. It's easier that way. At least it used to be. That evening, Aunt Carol's house looked like it belonged in one of those glossy home magazines. Spotless marble floors, gold-trimmed plates, and a chandelier so bright it made me squint. She'd been talking about this dinner for weeks. Her important guest, she called him, a business investor, someone who could help her husband's company. Everyone had to be perfect, polished, and impressive. I was invited, but not as a guest. My job was to help. Carol made that clear in her message. "Please come early, Nadine. I'll need you to set the table and make sure the food's plated right. This dinner's important. Don't embarrass us again." That last line stung. Again. She was referring to the Christmas dinner 2 years ago when I accidentally spilled a bit of red wine on her white tablecloth. She never forgave me for that, not because of the stain, but because, in her words, appearances matter. I still remember how everyone laughed, and I wanted to disappear. But tonight, I promised myself I'd stay quiet, do my part, and avoid being the family joke once more. As I unpacked her fine china, I listened to the hum of conversation in the next room. Carol's daughter, Cynthia, was bragging about her new designer handbag. Her tone was syrupy and condescending, the same tone she used with me whenever she asked for help carrying things to her car. Carol's husband, Richard, was pacing near the window, rehearsing small talk for his guest. I could tell they were nervous. I moved around the dining room carefully, aligning each plate and folding napkins the way Carol liked. Crisp, pointed, like little white crowns. I'd done this so many times before that my hands moved automatically. There was something comforting about it, almost meditative. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Carol was running back and forth, adjusting flowers, checking her reflection in the mirror every few minutes. "You're putting the forks too close to the edge," she said sharply as she passed, behind me. I stepped back and fixed them without a word. She didn't thank me. "Remember, Nadine," she continued, lowering her voice, "just stay in the background tonight. This isn't the time for storytelling or your usual small talk. We need to make a good impression." Storytelling, that's what she called it, the way I spoke when I got nervous, the way I'd try to connect with people by sharing bits of my life. Carol hated it. She said it made me sound desperate for attention, so I'd learned to stay quiet. But as she walked away, I caught sight of my reflection in the silver platter I was polishing. My face looked calm, but my eyes told another story. I'd spent years letting people like Carol talk down to me, years pretending that it didn't bother me, but tonight felt different. I didn't know why. When the doorbell rang, Carol nearly tripped over herself, rushing to answer it. "He's here," she whispered like a teenager about to meet a movie star. The room fell silent. I smoothed my apron and stepped aside, careful not to be in the way. From the doorway, I heard a deep, composed voice greeting Carol warmly. A man's voice. There was a weight to it, confident but kind. "Thank you for having me," he said. "Your home is beautiful." Carol laughed too loudly, ushering him in. "We're so honored to have you, Mr. Grayson. Please come in. Everyone's been so excited." Grayson. The name echoed in my mind for a moment. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. I peeked discreetly from the corner of the room as they walked in. He was tall, neatly dressed, with a calmness that seemed to draw everyone's attention. As he shook hands around the table, he caught me looking. For a brief second, our eyes met, and something flickered there, a spark of recognition I couldn't explain. His polite smile shifted slightly, almost like surprise. Then Carol stepped between us. "Oh, don't mind her," she said with an awkward laugh. That's just my cousin Nadine. She's helping out tonight. I forced a smile and nodded, pretending not to notice the sting in her words. He gave a courteous nod in return, but his gaze lingered for a heartbeat too long before turning back to Carol. As I stepped into the kitchen to fetch the appetizers, my hands trembled just slightly. I didn't know why that man's name or face felt so familiar, but something deep in my memory was stirring, something I hadn't thought about in years. And as I placed the final set of plates onto the serving tray, a strange certainty settled over me. Tonight wasn't going to be just another dinner. It was going to be the dinner that changed everything. When people ask me about my family, I usually say, we're close, in distance. It's my quiet way of masking the truth. We all live within 20 miles of each other, but emotionally, I might as well live on another planet. Carol made sure of that. I wasn't always the family disappointment. When I was younger, I believed that talent and hard work could make people proud of you. I used to paint, portraits, landscapes, anything that made me feel alive. I even had a small art studio for a while, but in my family, creativity was a hobby, not a career. When I told them I was applying for an artist residency, Carol laughed. That's cute, Nadine, she said, sipping her wine. But when are you going to get a real job? Her words stung back then, and they still echo now. I remember how everyone else nodded in agreement, as if ambition was something to be ashamed of. Then came my marriage, short, disappointing, and apparently the final confirmation that I was unlucky. My husband left after 2 years, chasing a career opportunity abroad, and I never heard from him again. Carol's sympathy lasted exactly one afternoon. By the next family gathering, she was joking. At least now you have more time for your little paintings. The laughter that followed that line still plays in my head when I can't sleep. The worst part was that I kept showing up. I kept believing that if I just smiled, if I just stayed kind, they'd see me differently. But kindness has a strange way of making you invisible in a family that values status over sincerity. I can still picture one Thanksgiving years ago. I'd spent 2 weeks crafting handmade gifts, small portraits of each family member painted on wood panels. It took me hours. When I handed them out, Carol smiled tightly and said, "Oh, how thoughtful." Then she whispered to her husband, thinking I couldn't hear, "What are we supposed to do with these?" Later, I found my painting of Cynthia sitting under a pile of napkins on the kitchen counter, half covered in cranberry sauce. That night, I promised myself I'd never bring them anything again. After that, I started attending fewer family events. I told myself it was because I was busy, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to keep volunteering to be humiliated. Still, when Carol invited me to dinners like tonight, I always said yes. Maybe it was loyalty, or maybe some stubborn part of me still wanted her approval. I told myself it was respect for my elders, but I think it was habit. Old wounds have a way of keeping you tethered to the people who caused them. As I straightened the silverware that evening, I could hear Cynthia in the next room, her voice lilting with superiority. "I just don't know how she does it," she said. "Living alone, no husband, no kids. I'd lose my mind." Carol's response was a sharp whisper, but I still caught the words. "Don't mention it in front of her. She gets sensitive." They didn't realize I could hear them. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, I kept folding napkins, pretending I was somewhere else. The truth was, I'd found comfort in the quiet life they pitied. My mornings were spent painting in my tiny sunroom, surrounded by plants and silence. I'd sold a few pieces online, even shipped some overseas, but I never told anyone. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd take credit if they did. I'd stopped needing their validation years ago, or at least I thought I had. But standing in that dining room, listening to them whisper, I realized the wounds hadn't fully healed. Carol's voice suddenly rose, the pitch of excitement breaking through my thoughts. "Oh, you're going to love this, Richard," she said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "Mr. Grayson's company just signed a partnership with a new publishing house. They're representing some very successful authors right now." Publishing house. The words hit me like a spark in dry grass. I froze, still holding a folded napkin between my fingers. Richard responded with the same enthusiasm Carol always demanded from him. "That's impressive. What's it called?" "Something Vale," Carol said, frowning slightly as she tried to remember. Vale Publishing or Vale Books, something like that. They've apparently launched bestsellers under pseudonyms. Mr. Grayson's firm made a fortune with one of their authors. I can't wait to ask him more about it tonight. My breath caught. Vale. I swallowed hard and turned back to the table, my pulse quickening. I knew that name better than anyone in that house, because I was the one who'd created it. Carol kept talking, her voice a distant buzz now. Maybe he'll give me a contact there, she said eagerly. It would be nice to have our name associated with something big for once. I tightened my grip on the napkin and forced a steady breath. They still saw me as the black sheep, the forgettable cousin with a dull life and no prospects. They had no idea that the very company Carol was bragging about was tied directly to me, to the secret world I'd built piece by piece after they all stopped believing in me. And tonight, fate had brought that world right to her dinner table. Carol's voice rang through the dining room again, full of rehearsed enthusiasm. Everyone, this is our honored guest, Mr. Dalton Grayson. The sound of that name stopped me cold. Dalton Grayson. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years, but my mind instantly filled in the rest. He was more than just a name. He was the investor who had backed Vale Publishing, the company that had first believed in me when no one else did. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay still. I bent slightly over the table, pretending to adjust a glass that didn't need adjusting. My fingers trembled against the crystal rim. It couldn't be the same Dalton Grayson, could it? The man who'd signed the distribution deal for my first novel? The one who'd written that personal note afterward, thanking N.R. Vale for reminding him what authentic storytelling felt like? I'd never met him in person, only through email exchanges and signatures on documents, but I remembered that name printed neatly at the bottom of every letter. The name that changed my life in ways no one in that house could have imagined. From the doorway, I heard the smooth confidence in his tone as he greeted everyone. Please call me Dalton. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Carol was practically glowing, hanging on to his every word. The pleasure's ours. We've been looking forward to this dinner for weeks. Richard, didn't I say he was exactly the kind of man who lights up a room? Her laughter sounded forced, brittle around the edges. I could almost hear the calculation behind every syllable, how to impress, how to flatter, how to make him believe she was part of his world. I stayed by the table, invisible as always. That had been my role for years, the quiet helper, the afterthought. No one ever really looked at me. They looked through me. That invisibility had hurt once, but tonight it was my shield. Dalton's footsteps drew closer as he admired the dining setup. This looks wonderful, he said, his voice warm but professional. Carol smiled like she'd plated the food herself. Oh, we just wanted everything to be perfect. My cousin helped, of course. Nadine, where did you go? I turned slowly, forcing a polite smile. Right here, I said quietly. Dalton's eyes found mine, steady, curious, and unexpectedly familiar. For a moment, it felt like he was searching for something in my face. Recognition flickered there, like a spark trying to catch flame. Carol broke the moment with a laugh that grated against my nerves. Nadine's always been so shy. She's good with her hands, though, loves little crafts and whatnot. Crafts. That's what she called my work. Crafts. I swallowed the bitter taste rising in my throat and simply nodded. I enjoy keeping busy. Inside, my thoughts raced. What were the chances? Of all the guests, of all the possible connections, him. The man who unknowingly helped me rebuild my life after everyone here had dismissed me. The man who gave N.R. Vale her start. I'd spent years keeping that name separate from my real one. The pseudonym had started as protection. Protection from mockery, from greed, from the very people now sitting across the room. I remembered the night I decided to sign my first manuscript under a false name. My hands had been shaking over the keyboard as I typed those 3 letters. N.R. Vale. It felt like both a lie and a liberation. When the book took off, I kept the secret close. The checks came through a business account. No interviews, no photos, no public appearances. My words traveled without me, and I preferred it that way. Because if my family ever found out, they'd turn my achievement into their accessory. Carol would claim she'd inspired me. Cynthia would beg for connections. And all of them would tell the world that they'd always believed in me. So I let them think I was ordinary, forgettable, powerless. As Dalton chatted with Richard about investments and Carol kept interjecting to brag about her garden, I stood in the background, half listening. Every mention of publishing, of authors, of new creative projects tightened the knot in my stomach. He laughed at something Richard said, his voice carrying across the room. "You'd be surprised how many authors work quietly for years before their big break," he said. "Some of the best ones prefer to stay out of the spotlight. I admire that." The words made my heart pound. It felt almost too pointed, too close to home. I looked up sharply, but he wasn't looking at Carol or Richard. His eyes were on me again. I quickly turned away, pretending to check the placement of a serving dish, but my composure was cracking. My mind replayed every word, every exchange I'd ever had with Vale Publishing. The late-night emails, the contract negotiations, the letter of appreciation signed Dalton Grayson. He had to know. Maybe he'd seen my author bio. Maybe something about my name or face clicked. Or maybe it was just coincidence. A shared intuition between two people who'd once worked together in words instead of faces. Carol's voice snapped me back. "Nadine, could you bring in the wine, please? Let's keep the table service moving." "Of course," I murmured, grateful for the escape. I slipped into the kitchen, gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened. The cool air helped steady me, but my thoughts raced on. If Dalton really recognized me, what then? Would he say it aloud? Would he connect Nadine Rowe to N.R. Vale in front of Carol and the others? No, that was impossible. No one would believe him. They'd probably laugh like they always did. I took a deep breath, lifted the wine bottle, and walked back into the dining room. The conversation buzzed on, light, shallow, and full of pretense. But I could feel Dalton's gaze following me as I poured the wine. When I set the last glass down, I finally glanced his way. He was mid-sentence, smiling politely at something Carol said, but then he stopped. His words faltered. His brow furrowed slightly, as if he were trying to place a half-forgotten melody. Then, in a quiet voice meant only for himself, I heard him whisper, "Vale?" Dinner had only just begun, but the room already felt like a stage, and I was the quiet prop that everyone forgot existed, except for Dalton Grayson. I could feel his eyes on me more than once. Not in the uncomfortable way that some men look, but with curiosity, almost confusion. Every time I entered the room to refill a glass or bring out another dish, his gaze followed, steady and searching, as if trying to connect a memory to a face. Carol noticed it too. Her smile tightened each time he looked my way. I knew that look. It was the one she wore when she felt her control slipping. She thrived on attention, and for once, it wasn't hers. "So, Mr. Grayson," she said in her most polished tone, "tell us more about your work. I imagine you meet so many fascinating people." Dalton smiled faintly. "Yes, quite a few, especially authors. It's the best part of the business, discovering new voices." I felt my breath catch again, but I kept my head down, focusing on the plates. Carol nodded eagerly. "Oh, we're all big readers here," she lied, though I doubted she could name a single author who wasn't on a talk show. "Cynthia just finished a book by, what was it, that Vale person?" Cynthia frowned, chewing. "Oh, right. The House of Winter, I think. It was okay. Kind of depressing." My heart thudded once in my chest. My book. Dalton's eyes flickered toward me again, but this time they didn't move away. There was recognition there now, faint, forming, undeniable. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the clinking of silverware. "Have we met before?" The question hung in the air. Carol's head snapped toward him, surprise painted on her face. "Met?" she repeated, half laughing. "With Nadine?" "Oh no, she doesn't travel in those circles. She's just my cousin. She helps around the house sometimes." I froze, my cheeks burning. Carol's words landed like a slap. Dalton's expression shifted, a quiet frown, a flash of disapproval before he hid it behind a polite smile. "Ah," he said softly. "I see." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I doubt we've met," I said, keeping my tone even. "I don't get out much these days." Carol laughed again, too loudly. That's an understatement. She spends most of her time painting little crafts and reading novels. Simple pleasures, right, Nadine? Yes, I said quietly. Simple pleasures. Dalton's gaze stayed on me a moment longer than was polite. There was a flicker of understanding there, the kind that comes from intuition rather than fact. I couldn't tell if it terrified me or thrilled me. Feeling the heat rise to my face, I murmured an excuse about checking on dessert and slipped back into the kitchen. The door swung shut behind me, and the air in there felt mercifully cooler. I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. I hadn't thought about the moment my life changed in a long time. The moment N.R. Vale was born. I could still see it clearly. It had been raining the night I uploaded my first manuscript to the publisher's online portal. My old laptop flickered, the cursor blinking like it was daring me to hit submit. I had no agent, no expectations, just a quiet ache to be heard. 3 months later, I received an email from Vale Publishing. We'd like to offer you a contract. When my book hit the market and sales took off, I didn't tell a soul. The first royalty check arrived while Carol was throwing one of her garden parties. I remember folding the check and tucking it into my pocket as she told a group of neighbors that I was finding little hobbies to keep busy. I smiled and served her guests lemonade that day, just as I was doing now. But that check, that single piece of paper, was the first proof that I'd built something entirely mine. And now, the man who helped make it happen was sitting just a few feet away, unknowingly surrounded by the very people who had once laughed me into silence. Fate has a cruel sense of humor sometimes. Or maybe it's justice. I steadied my hands and carried the dessert tray out. Carol was mid-laugh when she saw me return. "Finally," she said sharply. "Bring that over here." Dalton's eyes followed me again. "Ms. Rowe," he said gently, "could I trouble you for a moment after dinner? I'd love to ask you something." Carol nearly dropped her fork. "Oh, she's busy," she said quickly. "You mustn't bother her with formalities. Nadine likes to keep her hands full, don't you?" Her laugh was brittle, and everyone else chuckled weakly along with her. I could tell she was nervous now, confused by the attention she couldn't redirect. I smiled faintly. "It's no trouble," I said. "If there's something I can help with, I'll do my best." Dalton gave a small nod, that same puzzled look deepening. His expression was thoughtful, almost tender, and for a moment I felt exposed. As I began collecting plates, the conversation around me blurred into background noise. My thoughts were loud enough to drown it out, half of me praying he wouldn't press further, half of me wondering what would happen if he did. Could I keep pretending? Could I really stand there while Carol gloated about deals connected to my work? The weight of years spent hiding pressed down on me. Maybe fate wasn't cornering me. Maybe it was freeing me. Dalton stood as Carol tried to steer the conversation back to her husband's company. "Forgive me," he said, his tone calm but insistent. "I don't mean to interrupt again, but—" He turned toward me, eyes steady, voice quiet but certain. "Forgive me. Are you by any chance N.R. Vale?" The fork in my hand slipped and clattered onto the floor, and for the first time all evening, no one else made a sound. The sound of my fork hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot in the silence that followed. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. Every pair of eyes at that table turned to me. Carol's perfectly powdered face twisted in confusion. Cynthia's fork hovered mid-air, and Richard just blinked, as if trying to translate what he'd just heard. "N.R. Vale?" Carol repeated, her tone sharp and incredulous. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dalton's expression softened with realization. He looked from me to them, then back again. "It means," he said slowly, almost reverently, "that your cousin here isn't just helping around the house. She's the author whose books revived my entire publishing division." I stood frozen, my mind a blur of fear and disbelief. I hadn't expected this moment. Not here, not in Carol's dining room, surrounded by the very people who had once laughed me into silence. Carol's painted smile faltered. I think there's been some mistake," she stammered. "Nadine isn't... she's never..." Dalton shook his head, smiling. "No mistake. I'd recognize that face anywhere now. You wrote The House of Winter, didn't you? And Stillwater Rising? Those stories changed the trajectory of my company. You vanished right after your third book, and we've been trying to reach you for years." Cynthia's jaw dropped. "Wait, you wrote those?" she asked, as if she couldn't reconcile the idea with the image of me standing there in a plain dress and an apron. Yes, I said finally, my voice low but steady. I did. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air hung heavy with disbelief and awkwardness. Dalton leaned forward, eyes bright with admiration. You have no idea how much your work meant to us, and to me personally. The House of Winter pulled our firm out of a slump. We sold nearly 2 million copies in the first year. Your words, he paused, smiling, they reminded people what literature was supposed to feel like. The blood rushed to my face, but not from embarrassment, from the sheer strangeness of hearing my life's secret said aloud. I'm glad it found its readers, I said softly. That was always the goal. Carol's discomfort grew visible. She shifted in her seat, her false poise cracking. Oh, yes, she said suddenly, trying to recover. Of course we knew that. We've always been proud of Nadine's little writing projects, haven't we, Richard? Richard looked lost. Yes, absolutely. Cynthia nodded quickly, eyes darting between me and Dalton. We just didn't realize how successful you were. The table's energy flipped in an instant. The same people who dismissed me as insignificant now leaned forward, smiling too wide, asking too many questions. Carol's tone turned syrupy. Well, isn't that wonderful? We always said Nadine had talent. Didn't we say that? No, they hadn't. But I didn't correct her. I just smiled faintly. It's all right, Aunt Carol. I preferred peace over applause. The words slipped out naturally, calm and quiet, but I saw how they landed, like a mirror reflecting all their past cruelty back at them. Carol's smile faltered again. Dalton chuckled softly, clearly amused by my composure. Peace and applause aren't mutually exclusive, you know. You deserve both. The others rushed to agree, voices overlapping in desperate flattery. Cynthia leaned toward me, her voice suddenly sweet. You should have told us. We could have celebrated, maybe even hosted a launch party for you. I looked at her, remembering the Ania, cranberry-stained portrait she'd tossed aside years ago. You were busy, I said gently. Her cheeks colored, and she looked down at her plate. Dalton reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. Forgive the intrusion, but I can't pass up the chance, he said with a grin. Would you sign something for me? Right here. It would be an honor. Carol's jaw dropped. An autograph? He nodded enthusiastically. You'd be surprised how rare it is to meet someone whose work actually matters. I hesitated, then smiled faintly and took the pen. Of course. He slid a napkin across the table, and I scrawled my pseudonym across it, N.R. Vale. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding behind that name. When I handed it back, Dalton studied the signature as though it were a priceless artifact. Perfect, he said softly. I'm framing this. Carol forced a laugh, her tone strained. Oh, Dalton, surely you're exaggerating. He shook his head. Not at all. This woman's writing is worth more than all of my art investments combined. Carol's smile wavered, her eyes flicking nervously between me and him. You mean she's famous? Her voice cracked on the word, disbelief dripping from every syllable. I met her gaze evenly. Apparently so, I said, my tone calm, unflinching. For once, Carol had nothing else to say. The same silence that used to humiliate me now felt like power, still, steady, and deserved. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the chandelier above us. Carol stared at me as though she were trying to rewrite every memory she'd ever had of me. Dalton looked amused, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet admiration. Finally, I broke the silence. Well, I said softly, straightening the napkins one last time. I just did what you told me, Aunt Carol. I didn't embarrass you. The words hung in the air, gentle but razor sharp. Dalton's eyes lit up with laughter, though he kept it polite. Carol blinked, her painted smile faltering. For once, she didn't have a comeback. I suppose not, she managed, her tone brittle. You've done quite the opposite, actually. Dalton leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. She's done more than that, he said warmly. Nadine, your work didn't just save our publishing line. It revived our faith in storytelling. We've missed your voice in the industry. I smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you've finally laid down a burden you've carried too long. That's kind of you to say. I've been content to write quietly. It's peaceful that way. Carol jumped in quickly, her voice a little too bright. Yes, Nadine's always been so humble, she said, looking around the table as if daring anyone to contradict her. I always told her she had a gift. I encouraged her creativity, didn't I, Richard? Richard looked startled, then nodded automatically. Oh, yes, always. Dalton's gaze shifted toward her, polite but cool. It's wonderful when families support one another, he said evenly. I've met too many artists who felt misunderstood by their own. Carol gave a strained laugh. Oh, that wasn't us. We've always been supportive. I folded my hands and looked directly at her. You supported me by letting me serve dinner tonight, I said gently. A ripple of laughter went around the table. It wasn't mocking. It was knowing, honest laughter from those who understood the irony. Even Dalton chuckled softly, his expression one of quiet approval. Carol's face flushed crimson. Oh, Nadine, you do have a sense of humor, she said through gritted teeth. I try, I replied calmly. Cynthia, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. You must be, really famous, she said, her tone a mixture of awe and disbelief. Are you, rich? Dalton smiled faintly. Let's just say her royalties alone could fund more than a few dinners like this. Cynthia's eyes widened. Wow. I shrugged lightly. Success doesn't change who you are. It just reminds everyone else who they were. Dalton laughed outright this time, setting his glass down. You should put that in a book, he said. Carol's discomfort deepened, but she tried to play along. Well, perhaps we can all celebrate this new chapter together, she said. After all, family comes first, doesn't it? Of course, I said, matching her tone but not her meaning. Family taught me more than anyone else ever could. I felt lighter than I had in years. Their validation didn't matter anymore. Not the fake smiles, not the sudden apologies. I could see through all of it, and instead of anger, I felt peace. There was power in being underestimated. Dalton cleared his throat. Actually, Nadine, he began, there's something I'd like to propose, if I may. Carol perked up immediately, eager again. Oh? A business collaboration, perhaps? Not exactly, Dalton said, smiling. We're hosting an awards gala next month, a celebration of the authors who shaped our company's legacy. It would mean a great deal if you'd attend as our guest of honor, maybe even say a few words. The table went silent again. Carol's eyes darted between us, her mouth opening slightly. An awards gala? She echoed. Yes, Dalton said. You've been out of the public eye for too long, Ms. Vale. It's time the world heard your story, in your own voice. I felt my pulse quicken. For years, I'd written behind the safety of anonymity, content to let my words speak without my face attached. But now, as I looked around that table, at the same faces that had once sneered at me, I realized that perhaps it was time. Carol leaned forward, her tone falsely sweet. Oh, how lovely. We should all go. Together. After all, family... Dalton interrupted gently. Actually, invitations are limited to featured guests and publishing staff, but I'm sure Nadine will let you know how it goes. Carol's smile froze mid-sentence, her face twitching. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I'd be honored, I said softly, though public speaking isn't usually my thing. Dalton grinned. You'll do wonderfully. You have more grace in one sentence than most people manage in a lifetime. Carol's laughter returned, forced and sharp. Oh, yes, Nadine's always been graceful. I looked at her steadily, my voice calm and even. Not always, but I've learned. There was a pause, the kind of silence that humbles everyone in it. I stood to start clearing the dishes again, and Dalton rose too. Allow me, he said, taking one of the trays from my hands. Carol's voice cracked slightly. Oh, Mr. Grayson, you don't have to. I insist, he said, smiling at me. After all, we're celebrating the woman who wrote half the words I've ever been proud to publish. My throat tightened. I wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Not truthfully. Thank you, I murmured. Carol's eyes darted from me to him, jealousy flickering beneath her composure. Dalton smiled again, softer this time. We'll talk more about the gala soon, he said. The world deserves to know your name, Nadine. As he sat back down, the table buzzed with shallow chatter. Questions, congratulations, empty flattery, but I barely heard any of it. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible, and for once, the silence that surrounded me wasn't shame, it was power. Then Dalton's voice broke through the noise, calm and deliberate. "Nadine," he said, "I'd like you to be our keynote speaker at the awards night." Every head turned toward me again. Carol's face went pale, and I smiled. I'd be honored. By the time dessert was cleared, the evening had turned into something entirely different from what Carol had planned. She had wanted to impress Dalton Grayson, to flaunt her perfect home and well-groomed family. Instead, her helpful cousin had stolen the spotlight without even trying. I could feel it in the way people's eyes followed me now, curious, reverent, calculating. The same relatives who once ignored me now smiled too brightly, their compliments sticky with sudden admiration. "You simply must tell us about your writing process, Nadine," Carol said with forced enthusiasm as she poured coffee into Dalton's cup. "I've always said she was the creative one in the family." Dalton chuckled softly. "It's clear she's more than that. You're lucky to have her." Lucky. That word must have tasted like vinegar on Carol's tongue. When the laughter faded and the polite chatter resumed, I slipped away quietly. I gathered my bag and coat from the hallway and took one last glance at the glittering dining room. They were all still talking. Carol, Richard, Cynthia, laughing too loudly, trying too hard. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to stay. I had nothing left to prove. "Leaving already?" Carol's voice startled me as I reached for the front door. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor. "Yes," I said, turning to face her. "It's been a long evening." She forced a smile, her eyes flicking nervously toward the dining room where Dalton was still seated. Of course. You must be exhausted. I just wanted to say—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I hope you know how proud we are of you." The word proud sounded foreign coming from her. "I appreciate that," I said calmly. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Maybe we could catch up sometime, just the two of us. You can tell me all about your books, and I'll tell you what's been going on with the family. It's been too long." The warmth in her voice was all surface, like the gloss on her polished furniture. I recognized it for what it was, not affection, but strategy. "Maybe someday," I said, slipping my coat on, "but not right now." Her face faltered for a split second, the mask slipping. "Of course," she said quickly, forcing another smile. "Whenever you're ready." "I'll let you know," I said, though we both knew I wouldn't. I stepped out into the night. The cool air wrapped around me, sharp and clean, washing away the heaviness of the house behind me. For the first time in years, I felt light, not triumphant, not vengeful, just free. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The quiet hum of the street was a strange comfort. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The same face they'd dismissed for so long, now calm and certain. I didn't need their validation. I never really had. As I drove home, memories began to stir. Nights spent hunched over my old desk, writing by lamplight while rain tapped against the window. I remembered the exhaustion, the rejection letters, the moments I almost gave up, and I remembered the laughter, Carol's laughter, Cynthia's, all of them, when I'd told them I wanted to be a writer. They called it a phase, they called me naive. But those nights alone had built me. Every insult had become a brick in the quiet fortress of my resolve. There was a time I'd cry after their family dinners, sitting in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I'd tell myself I didn't care, but I always did. Their words lingered like smoke. Not tonight. Tonight, as I pulled into my driveway, I didn't feel anger or bitterness, just peace. Real peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for people to see your worth. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the faint glow of streetlights on the wet pavement. My phone buzzed once, a message from Dalton. "It was a pleasure meeting you tonight. Expect something in the mail soon. A formal invitation. You'll be our guest of honor. DG." I smiled to myself. He didn't owe me that courtesy, but it spoke to who he was. Kind, genuine. Someone who saw me before the world did. For a moment, I thought about how the younger version of me, the one who cried after every gathering, would have felt right now. Vindicated? Maybe. But mostly, I think she'd feel relieved to know she'd survived without losing her heart. I set the phone down, finished my tea, and let the silence of my small house fill the room. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was mine, built on words and willpower. Just as I was preparing to turn in for the night, my phone rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't have to. The hesitation before the voice spoke confirmed it. "Nadine, it's Carol." I didn't answer right away. Her tone was different this time, not commanding, not smug. It was trembling, almost pleading. "I was just thinking," she said after a pause. "Maybe we could talk about that gala. I might know a few people who could help you." I closed my eyes, listening to the desperation between her words. Her voice cracked softly. "Please, Nadine, don't shut me out." I said nothing, letting the silence speak for me. "Hello?" she said again, uncertain now. I smiled faintly, then whispered, "Good night, Aunt Carol." And I hung up. The phone went quiet, and for the first time, so did my heart. 3 days after the dinner, I was in my garden, trimming roses, when I heard a familiar car pull into the driveway. I knew that sound. Carol's silver sedan, the one she used to brag, was imported and elegant, unlike domestic models. The same car she never once parked in my neighborhood before. I wiped my hands on my apron and waited. Part of me hoped she'd just leave whatever message she'd come to deliver and go. But of course, that wasn't Carol. A moment later, her heels clicked up my walkway, followed by her perfume. That sharp, citrusy scent that always arrived before she did. "Nadine," she called in a tone too high, too sweet. "I was just in the neighborhood." I smiled faintly. "Were you?" She hesitated before nodding. "Well, not exactly, but I thought I'd stop by. I realize we haven't had a proper chat in ages." I gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to sit?" Her relief was visible. "Oh, thank you. I'd love that." We sat opposite each other, the air heavy with spring warmth and unspoken words. She looked uncomfortable, out of place among my mismatched chairs and flower pots. I offered her tea. She declined, then immediately changed her mind. Actually, yes. Tea would be lovely. When I returned, she was fidgeting with her purse, rehearsing something silently. I set her cup down. Gently. "Sugar?" "Just a little," she said, though she always took 2 heaping spoons. We sipped in silence for a while before she spoke. "I wanted to apologize," she said abruptly, her voice trembling slightly, for the way I've treated you over the years." I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I didn't mean to sound dismissive," she went on, her eyes darting toward the roses instead of me. "It's just that you always seemed so content with your little hobbies, and I thought, I didn't think you'd make anything of it." Her honesty was clumsy, but real, and I appreciated that much at least. "I see," I said softly. She rushed to fill the silence. "And when you succeeded, I was surprised. And I suppose I was jealous. You know how it is. We all make mistakes." Her voice cracked on the last word. I looked at her. The woman who had spent years reminding me of every shortcoming, every supposed failure. The woman whose approval I once chased like sunlight through clouds. But now she just looked small. Not cruel, not powerful, just human. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said. Her eyes widened. "You did?" "Yes," I said simply, "because holding on to resentment only made me tired. I realized your opinions stopped mattering the moment I stopped living to please them." She blinked, unsure whether to feel relieved or wounded. "That's kind of you." "It's not kindness," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's peace." Carol looked down at her cup, stirring sugar she'd already dissolved. "I suppose I deserve that." "You've always been better at letting things go." I smiled faintly. "Not better, just practiced." A long pause followed before she spoke again. "About that gala next month," she began, her tone too casual to be sincere. "It sounds like quite an event. I'd love to come with you, if you'd like the company." There it was. The real reason for her visit. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. "That's kind of you to offer, but the invitation's just for me. And honestly, Carol, I think it's something I need to do alone." Her expression faltered, though she tried to hide the disappointment behind a brittle laugh. Of course, I just thought, well, it would be nice to support you, finally. You can support me from here, I said gently. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief moment her facade cracked. Her voice softened. You know, Nadine, I always envied how calm you were, even when I said things I shouldn't have. You never fought back. I mistook that for weakness. I know, I said, but silence isn't always surrender. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time, I saw something that resembled remorse. Real remorse. I stood and walked inside for a moment, leaving her alone on the porch. When I returned, I carried a small hardcover book, my newest release, still smelling faintly of fresh ink. I held it out to her. She blinked in surprise. For me? I nodded. It's my latest. I thought you might like a signed copy. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. Thank you, she whispered. I opened the front page and wrote a simple note. To Carol. Thank you for being part of the story, even when you didn't realize it. Nadine Rowe, N.R. Vale. I handed it to her without another word. She looked down at the inscription, her lips trembling as she read it silently. For a moment I thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just clutched the book like something fragile and precious. I'll treasure it, she said finally, her voice small. I hope you do, I replied softly. When she left, I stood at the porch railing and watched her car drive away. The sun was sinking low, staining the sky in shades of orange and gold. I breathed in the quiet, the kind that feels earned, not empty. I turned back toward the house, my mind already on the gala. It would be my first public appearance in years, a chance to finally step out from behind the name that had shielded me for so long. And as I set my teacup down, I felt the tiniest flutter of nerves, not from fear, but anticipation. For the first time in my life, the world would see me. Not the servant at the table, not the forgotten cousin, but the woman who had written her own redemption. The night of the gala arrived like something out of a dream I'd once been too afraid to imagine. The city shimmered in golden glass as I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the marble entrance of the grand Orpheum Hall. A soft breeze caught the hem of my navy gown, elegant, simple, unpretentious, the kind of dress that felt like me. Cameras flashed along the red carpet, but they weren't the paparazzi kind. These were kind eyes, respectful, eager. For years, I had hidden behind my pen name, content to let my stories speak for me. Now, my name, my real name, was printed on the event banner. Guest of honor, Nadine Rowe, N.R. Vale, the voice behind millions of words. Inside, the hall glowed with amber light and anticipation. I spotted Dalton Grayson near the stage, chatting with a few editors and executives. When he noticed me, he smiled. The same calm, knowing smile that had first cut through Carol's arrogance like sunlight through a cloud. You made it, he said, offering his arm as I approached. I almost didn't, I admitted. But then I remembered, I promised myself to stop hiding. And we're all grateful you did, he said sincerely. It's time your readers knew the woman behind the words. The evening moved like a soft current, handshakes, warm introductions, compliments that felt genuine for once. Every person who approached me spoke with gratitude, not flattery. They told me how my stories had comforted them through loss, or reminded them that beauty could bloom in ordinary lives. I'd never known that silence. The same silence my family once used to belittle me could be replaced by applause. But here it was, gentle, earned, real. When Dalton finally took the podium, his voice carried over the audience. Tonight, we celebrate a writer whose stories redefined what honesty in literature looks like. A woman whose words reached hearts across the world, all while she lived humbly and quietly among us. Then he turned toward me. Please welcome, for the first time publicly, Nadine Rowe. The applause rose like a wave. I walked onto the stage, every step measured, steady. The lights were bright, almost blinding, but they felt warm instead of harsh. I looked out over the sea of faces, strangers who somehow felt like friends. I took a breath, then spoke. When I started writing, I said, my voice steady, I did it because silence had become too heavy to carry. For years I was told I wasn't enough, not successful enough, not clever enough, not realistic enough, and I believed that, for a while. I paused, feeling the words settle over the room. But silence, I learned, can be a kind of soil. If you let it, it grows something inside you. My silence grew stories. My solitude became strength. And the people who doubted me, I smiled faintly. They gave me space to find my own voice. For that, I thank them too. You gave me silence to grow. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft and reverent. As I spoke, flashes of memory filled my mind. Carol's sharp voice saying, "Don't embarrass us again." The laughter around that dinner table years ago. The tears I wiped away in my car after gatherings where I'd been treated like invisible background noise. The long nights in my small home, writing while the world slept. Those moments no longer hurt. They simply were. Pieces of a story that led me here. My success, I continued, was never about revenge. It was about peace. And the greatest piece of all is realizing you don't need anyone's permission to be proud of who you are. When I finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause wasn't wild or theatrical. It was heartfelt, grounding. I felt it in my chest, like a heartbeat I'd forgotten was mine. Afterward, I signed autographs for a line of readers that stretched down the hall. A young woman approached, clutching a worn copy of The House of Winter. "Your words saved me," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. I smiled and took her hand. "No," I said softly. "They reminded you that you could save yourself." She laughed through her tears. "Maybe both." As the crowd thinned, Dalton found me again. "You did beautifully," he said. "You've inspired me more than you know." I smiled. "You gave me a chance when no one else did. I should be the one thanking you." He shook his head. "You would have found your way either way, Nadine. People like you always do." The evening finally ended. I walked out into the cool night air, clutching the small bouquet someone had handed me. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky, and for the first time, I didn't feel small beneath them. I thought about Carol, how she'd probably watched the live stream, maybe holding the signed book I'd given her, torn between pride and regret. A part of me hoped she'd learned something, but I didn't need to know. Some stories are better left in quiet endings. As my driver opened the car door, I glanced back at the grand hall one last time. The night air carried faint echoes of applause, mingled with the hum of traffic, the sound of a world that had finally seen me. And in that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Grace would always outshine spite. I smiled to myself, a deep, unshakable peace blooming in my chest. "I once set their table in silence," I whispered. "Now the world sets mine." Then I stepped into the car, ready to begin the next chapter of my life, not as the black sheep of a judgmental family, but as the woman who turned silence into strength. In the end, I didn't need to raise my voice or seek revenge. Life handed me the stage I was once denied. The same silence they mocked became the strength that defined me. I learned that sometimes the loudest victory is quiet grace. They once made me set their table in shame. But today, the world sets mine. With respect, not pity. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who's ever been underestimated. Sometimes the quiet ones carry the loudest victories, and their stories deserve to be heard. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for more true stories of quiet revenge and redemption. But tell me honestly, if you were in my place that night, would you have stayed silent or finally spoken your truth?